Very good evening to everybody watching. Thank you for joining us tonight on the evening review. My name is Toiwan Jabela. Tonight on the platform, we are joined by Professor Henning Melber. He is a Namibian academic based in Uppsala, Sweden. And he made headlines over the weekend after he tendered his resignation from the ruling party, Swapo. The professor will explain reasons shortly. Thank you very much, Prof, for coming back to the platform. It's been a minute since we had you. Just walk us through in not so many words, first and foremost, your decision to resign from the ruling party. Is it something that you've been contemplating for a long time, or is it something that just really hit you lately due to certain reasons?
Good evening, Toivo, and good evening to all viewers. Thank you for providing me the opportunity to talk on an issue which is very emotional. I just saw for the first time the insert which calls me a former Swapo member. And that was a very emotional confrontation with a new reality.
Yeah.
It was not planned. It came about from the dynamics unfolding since a week ago when we learned about the passing on of Solomon Hawala, who had the nom de guerre Jesus. And it brought back to me the memories of what I always considered the darkest moment and times of Swapo when it comes to the treatment of hundreds, if not thousands, of Swapo members who had joined the movement in exile and were since the late 1970s exposed to a witch hunt, persecuted, tortured, killed for never proven accusations of being spies. And it was on my conscience all the time that we never, as Swapo, were willing to deal with the issue, which in my view meant we lost the moral high ground we always had claimed. When Hawala passed on, I tried to articulate what I considered a window of opportunity in an article published in the Namibian on Wednesday to bury with Hawala, and I added, may his soul rest in peace, to bury parts of an unresolved history by finally, after 35 years, showing remorse and atonement to the few survivors still alive who were never rehabilitated. The next day, Thursday evening, I was then confronted with the announcement that the opposite will take place, that Solomon Hawala was awarded a state funeral, declared a national hero and an icon of the liberation struggle. To make it very clear, my reaction was not about crucifying, allow me that game of words, to crucifying Jesus Hawala. It was about using his passing on as a reference point to deal with the issue he most of the securocrats personified. And when the opposite took place, which I considered a sign of continued denialism and amnesia, I first reacted Thursday evening being totally numb. And after a good night's rest, I woke up Friday morning with the thought, I have to resign. It was not planned, it came about, but it was basically something which was on my mind and conscience since 35 years.
So, Prof, when you say that Swapo has never dealt with the issue of the Lubango dungeons, what exactly do you mean? I mean, in what way do you think Swapo should have dealt with the matter, given that there were two parties to this war, and if one party must atone for its alleged atrocities and not the other one, I mean, just the practicalities of it, if you can enlighten me on your thoughts.
I use the term moral high ground. And what I mean is, while the paradigm issued under Tatekulu President Nujoma at independence was national reconciliation, implying in contrast to South Africa that there won't be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that it was considered a tit for tat, meaning we don't speak about the atrocities and crimes committed of a much bigger scope and dimension by the apartheid regime, but we also, in that construction or arrangement, will not raise the issues where we violated human rights in our own ranks. I think this is a wrong equation. And it's an equation which was not really rigorously implemented.
Yeah.
Because in the failure of the Germans for decades to deal with the Holocaust, and I'm not comparing the Holocaust with what we are discussing, but in the engagement with the failure to truly engage until the 1960s, there was a big book published with the title, The Inability to Mourn, meaning to avoid engaging with their own failures. And when I look at the official memory culture since independence, we rightly so commemorate the massacre at the old location. We commemorate Kasinga Day. We commemorate Ongulumbashe. We finally, since this year, commemorate the genocide committed by the Germans, but we are not commemorating the losses inflicted on hundreds, if not thousands, of Namibians by our own hands, by Swapo. That is not an ability to mourn, because it's a selective commemoration. And I don't care if the apartheid culprits are not dealt with in the sense of punishment. I also never expected that individual securocrats in the ranks of Swapo would individually be taken to task. That's not the issue. The issue is not to talk about systematic injustices committed. Instead of offering hand of reconciliation to their own people who were the subject of injustices committed. That is why I say we have failed to maintain a moral high ground. And I'm willing to accept, as a German novelist once called it, that war shapes its people. If I wouldn't, I would have had to leave Swapo in 1989, when in June of that year, the few hundred survivors from the dungeons were brought back to Namibia. Because then everyone who wanted to know could know that we committed heinous crimes.
I've asked you must have watched the interview I did with Pauline Dempers, one of the survivors, on Sunday, where I put this question to her, and I'm putting it to you also, Professor, to say that, of course, what is concerning for me is what, as far as that episode is concerned, is the seemingly absence of a process to determine who was guilty of spying, if at all, and who was not. In other words, you want to accuse someone of that treasonous act after having gone through some sort of process of hearings and all that. Of course, interrogations perhaps is what took place, is the best that they could do. But do you admit, Professor, that spies did exist within the rank and file of Swapo, and that treason, and that spying is actually treason, even in the modern democratic dispensation? If you go to your Americas today, you could be hanged for such a crime. So it's a serious crime if proven. But do you accept that at least are we on the same page as far as that point is concerned?
I have absolutely no doubts that spies had infiltrated Swapo. Absolutely no doubts. But the decisive point you also referred to, there were video clips spread where people under torture were forced to make confessions, were forced to implicate others for sheer survival and ending the torture, with no other forms of verification to what extent such suspicions and accusations were actually justified. I'm not demanding, under the situation of a warfare as it was in the 1970s and 1980s, that there is an ordinary court with witnesses, with lawyers in defense of the accused, to reaching a ruling. That was not the situation. But there should have been a minimum degree of reasonable doubt that not all the hundreds of people accused and tortured to make confessions were indeed spies. Bean's governess is one of the examples. She spoke out, that's why I dare to mention her name. She returned from the dungeons. I dare anyone to come public and accuse her of having been a spy. What brought her to the dungeons? And there are many others I knew that come to my mind where I personally have no doubt that they were accused for wrong reasons. That makes the difference. we had a witch hunt with a totally uncontrolled obsession unfolding in response maybe to setbacks in the military struggle. I'm sure Kasinga, as the massacre, was one of the triggering points which fueled the wrath, the hate, born out of helplessness maybe, that motivated some of the securocrats. But that would have been, in my view, the challenge and the task afterwards, to deal with it, to look for the reasons, to find explanations. That is the true meaning in a universal context of the saying, never again. That we go to it, we revisit it, and admit that mistakes were made. And again, let me add, not to punish any of the individuals. In your conversation with Pauline on Sunday evening, she also stressed that it was about a system. And he was maybe the most visible in executing orders. It's not about punishing him. It's about exploring what happened and trying to deal with the guilt.
Absolutely. We go for a very short break and return with Professor Henning Melber. Our conversation with Professor Henning Melber, who is speaking to us from Sweden, continues. Professor, how do we then, because there's been like I wrote in one of my editorials, I think last week, I said that to deny also that Jesus Hawala, apart from the Lubango episode, elsewhere he did some heroic work for the liberation of our country. How do we balance these two contrasting episodes of his life? Because you know, he's accused of having presided over those Lubango atrocities as a commander of some sort, and then having also fought the war to liberate the country. Where do we draw the line to determine whether he was a heroic fighter or a man with a very checkered history?
I believe there is no line to be drawn. We all are living with ambivalences and ambiguities. I wouldn't know where to try to draw the line when it comes to myself. What of my behavior is on the good side and what is on the bad side? And it very much also depends on the perspectives of those who make the judgment. So I do understand why in the perception of many, Solomon Hawala is praised for executing military duties before independence and after independence. But in the same spirit, he was willing to execute atrocities. Now, there is no line to be drawn. The point I'm trying desperately to make is we should engage with the contradictions, with the moral and the ethical implications, guided by fundamental values and principles, a kind of a moral compass. So Solomon Hawala is an example that he sacrificed much of his life in duty for the liberation of Namibia. Who would want to criticize him for that? But that duty included to unscrupulously execute Namibians without any secure evidence that they have committed any wrongdoing. And that is the dilemma we should face. And I'm convinced if we as Swapo would be willing to engage in that in such an open way, we would gain more credibility. Our slogan has been until the very day, solidarity, freedom, and justice. And justice would mean to do justice also to the contradictions and ambivalences of cases and individuals.
Do you think, don't you think, Professor, that we are asking too much of a former liberation movement to sort of almost come after those that it has tasked to filter through its rank and file who was dedicated to the genuine fight for independence and who was not? So as a movement, you did that. You put a person like Jesus Hawala, you are a chief of intelligence or whatever his portfolio was, and go out there and filter out and find out, sniff around for those that are actually have been planted within our rank and file to betray our mission and even to destroy us from within. And then after executing those instructions, because like you are saying, and also what Pauline Dempa said last night, is to say that this is a system that brought him to do that. And then after independence, you then come after a guy like Jesus Hawala and say, now, what you did was atrocious. You are a disgrace to this country. You are not a hero. I mean, how does Swapo get to do that itself when the system that we are talking about was actually responsible for tasking him to do that?
You used a word which I would avoid. You said you were disgrace. That's a moral judgment which overlooks the implications of an armed struggle for liberation. As I said before, war shapes its people. And I agree and admit it's a very tough challenge to face the failures that happened in the struggle, especially because they were not individual failures, but they were personified by individuals as a kind of a system. So trying to come clean, or not to come clean, but at least to engage with what happened, implies to engage with structures and meaning a multitude of people who either acted similarly or knew about what was happening, willing to accept it, or even giving the orders that it happens. That's asked a lot. But not to dealing with it, the matter won't go away. We are talking about that issue 40 plus years later. Like the genocide committed 120 years ago, it won't go away.
Yeah.
So a festering wound can only try to be healed by paying attention to it. The decision to recognize Hawala in the role of a national hero and icon of the liberation struggle, shuts down the other side, not only of him, but also of the liberation struggle. That is a dilemma, and I think that dilemma will not go away by just closing eyes and ears.
Yeah, yeah. In not so many words, Professor, because we've run out of time, the last question is really just after independence, Swapo has gone through a lot of challenges, corruption, under delivery. There's been episodes of that nature. Everybody, even in Swapo itself, admit there's been failures on the part of the party, as much as there's been successes also, freedom and other things. Why, of all things, was this the turning point? Because when you are not delivering medicine to hospitals, people could die. When corruption is rampant, opportunities are taken away from society from growing and all that. But somehow this is really where you draw the line. What makes this one, in not so many words, the distinct moment for you to say, but this is enough?
Because it's much more about fundamental principles of human rights, of coming to terms with a past where we committed crimes, atrocities. In any society, you will find failures in governance. If the mere act of corruption or lack of service delivery would be sufficient reason to resign from a party, then I would assume in hardly any country of the world the parties would have more members than the culprits. So there is for me a difference between the violation of human rights we committed during the struggle days without addressing them and the failures since independence, which, as many know, I always raised, dishing freely out my opportunities as a member of Swapo when I felt we did not live up to the promises.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor, for coming on. We really appreciate your time and also for sharing your perspectives. We appreciate that.
I am very grateful that you offered me the opportunity to explain in a bit more detail what makes me tick.
Wonderful. That's Professor Henning Melber, who resigned from the ruling party Swapo on Saturday, expanding just on the reasons for that reason that came after so many years of being a Swapo member. Thank you for watching.